into the message today, I just wanted to say thanks again, church family, for praying for my family and the loss of our grandson, Kai. But this time tomorrow, there will be another Martin coming. My 10th grandchild should be here tomorrow sometime, so keep us in your prayers, and keep Heath in your prayers. He just left the drum show probably to go straight to wherever he needs to go and get ready. But anyway, thank you for praying for us. Keep us in your prayers. We've been on this study of David, and we're going to continue today with a message called The Spin Zone. I met Ray in college. We were both studying for the ministry, and Ray was one of those guys at a very early age that was very, very talented. He had a background in radio, so he had a radio voice. You know, those radio voices that are mellow and they just capture your attention. And so therefore, he was a very good communicator. And he just kind of captured your attention with that voice. But he was also a very talented pastor as well. And when we graduated, he went back to where he was from, which was Atlanta, Georgia, and pastored a church there. And it wasn't too long after he got there that he called me and asked me if I would come out there and help them and be on staff there doing the worship there. And so we did. We went to Atlanta with our two young girls, just two at the time, very young girls, and we got involved in the church, and it wasn't long before we met a lot of couples our age, and there were two in particular that we began to get close to. It was Ray and his wife, and me and Diana, and then there was Tommy and his wife, Fred and his wife. And so our kids were really close to the same age, so we would just kind of do everything together. We went out to eat, we'd go to each other's houses, play games, and so we just kind of grew together. And everything was fine for a while until we noticed something a little bit strange going on. Tommy was a businessman who had to travel a lot, and we noticed sometimes that when he was gone, Tommy's wife would call Ray to help with something. I don't know if there's something around the house or to be taken somewhere. And at first we didn't think anything about it. We were all pretty close. But as time went on, we began to notice, let me put it this way, my wife began to notice that something was not right. And I mean, she spoke a few things, and I said, we're all friends. Surely it's okay. But as it turned out, her intuition was right on, spot on. And we didn't know it yet, but we would later find out that Tommy's wife got pregnant. And we knew it wasn't Tommy's because Tommy had 3 boys already, and he had already taken care of business, if you know what I mean. And probably he might have gotten away with it, because the sad thing is the pregnancy was ended, the baby was aborted. And it would have seemed like the cover-up was going to work, but Ray's wife found something on her credit card statement that raised a flag. And as it turned out, it was something that he had bought for her, and she knew that she didn't get it. And so thus began a downward spiral. And 2 families, each with small children, ripped apart. 5 boys total, 2 in one family, 3 in the other, ripped apart. A baby's life lost. And when it was all said and done, Ray had lost his family, he lost his church, he lost his reputation. It's hard to believe that someone so talented and gifted could fall so quickly. But it happens all the time, doesn't it? And I'm sure that you can relate to this, because I dare say that you know someone who has done or gone through the same thing. It may be you that were on the victim side of that. It may have been you who caused that. But the thing that my friend Ray and King David and that person that you know or that person that you are have in common is that they all entered what I call the spin zone. Now, the spin zone is when you enter God's no-sin zone out of lust for power or sex or money or influence or whatever. And once you're in that spin zone or that no-sin zone and you fall to that temptation to sin, you start going into the spin zone. It happened at the very beginning with Adam and Eve. God had a no-sin zone, you remember? And they fell to that temptation, thus began the cover-up. No, it's her fault. No, it's his fault. No, it's the serpent's fault. And the spin began, and you know the rest of the story. So this is what happened in David's life. And if you ask the average person what they think of when they think of King David, if you ask a child will say Goliath. But if you ask an adult, chances are they're going to say Bathsheba. And those are two of the greatest personalities in David's life, because Goliath represented David's fiercest victory, but Bathsheba represented David's worst defeat. And so we're going to continue the story of King David in 2 Samuel chapter 11, if you want to turn there. And of course the verses are on the screen. And again, as I've told you every week, the narrative is so long that we have to kind of just read between the lines and talk about things. But we're going to continue his story in 2 Samuel 11. Now, the incredible thing, in one sense, is you would never expected 2 Samuel chapter 11 to even be a chapter in David's life. Because up until this time, basically everything David had touched had turned to gold. When you read the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, I mean, David batted 1,000. He was never defeated in battle. He was never wrong in his judgment. His approval rating was 100%, economically, militarily, financially. The country was at an all-time high. So what happened? At this point, David is about 50 years old. He's been on the throne approximately 20 years. And he has so many titles that he can't keep them all on one wall. He's the nation's #1 songwriter. He's the nation's #1 soldier. He's the undisputed leader of God's people. The Bible calls him a man after God's own heart. But as we look at this part of David's life, understand that we're not looking at a midlife crisis. Because had you examined David's life closely, you would have realized that there were some chinks in David's armor. There were some cracks in his foundation. And here's where it happened. I'm going to show you a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 17. God laid down specific rules for anyone who would be king. And I want you to see there are 3 rules. Here's what they are. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. Rule number 1, you can't acquire a whole lot of horses, because to do that, you'd have to go back to Egypt to get them, and you're not going to go back to Egypt. So, number 1 rule, no more horses. You know, the king, Saul and King David both rode mules. So, great numbers of horses, rule number 1. Rule number 2, he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. And then rule number 3, he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Now, David was faithful in the first rule and the third rule, but he failed miserably in the second. Because 6 chapters before, in 2 Samuel, we read these words. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. David had 8 wives. 8 wives. That's at least 8 mothers-in-law. And on top of that, he had at least 10 concubines. So lust and polygamy were the chinks in David's armor. They were the cracks in his foundation. And as we go through this epic time of the life of David, we leave that stage of triumph and tenderness, and we enter into the stage of tragedy and trouble. And here's what we're going to learn today. All that is necessary to enter the spin zone is to be in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong person, and then do the wrong thing. This is what happened to David. This is exactly what happens to us. We find ourselves at the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong person, and that temptation to sin is so strong that we then do the wrong thing. And then begins this downward spiral that I'm calling the spin zone. So 2 Samuel 11, we're going to read, and I'll explain as I go, but we're going to learn from David what to do and what not to do when we're tempted. So verse 1, we begin. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem, and we learn immediately that David was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Instead of being at home, he should have been in battle. But all that's necessary to enter that spin zone is to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong person, and then do the wrong thing. So it's spring. The rainy season is over. The weather's gorgeous outside, but David was not where he should be. And the fact is, if David had been where he belonged, as the commander-in-chief with his army, then what happens next would never have happened. Look at what happens. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. So, as was his prerogative, he took an afternoon nap. He wakes up, he decides to walk outside. Kings frequently built their bedrooms up on the roof of what we would call a patio roof. And so he's walking out on what we would call a patio roof, and then we read these words, "From the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful." Now I looked up the Hebrew word for beautiful. It means smoking hot. Just thought you might want to know that. But she's simply doing what a lot of women in the city would do at that time of day. It's the late afternoon, and the water that's been collected in rain barrels is warm. And the husbands were often away at work anyway, or battle. And so a woman would bathe usually in the afternoon, which was the warmest time of the day. Well, at this point, had David just simply turned and walked back into the house or the palace, everything would have been fine. But here's what we read. And David sent someone to find out about her. And the man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Now, I don't want you to miss the significance of that statement to David. This servant that David sent, in a very subtle and respectful way, was trying to give David a wise word of warning. Normally in Israel, the identity of a person would be given without any relation to their spouse. You would have said, "That's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam," and left it there. But this servant goes a little bit further. And he makes a point saying, she's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah. Basically saying, David, back off. She's married. Very subtle. Tried to tell him. But it was at that moment that David began to say no to all the things he should have said yes to, and yes to all the things he should have said no to. And in the next verse, he begins to enter the spin zone. He's already been at the wrong place at the wrong time, and now he's about to get with the wrong person. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. How could this happen so quickly? Bathsheba was simply the culmination of something that had been going on in David's life for 20 years. He didn't just wake up one morning and say, you know what, I got a great idea. I think today I will destroy my life by committing adultery and be a murderer. No. It had been an accumulation of what was happening the last 20 years. And it was a downward spiral that had been going on in his life for 2 decades. I'm going to show you in a moment what I mean. But I want to stop here for just a second, and I want you to write down some great biblical advice. When you're tempted to sin, you need to flee temptation. Don't fight it. Flee temptation, don't fight it. It's right here in this part of the story where you want to press the pause button and you want to scream at the top of your lungs, David, don't do this. Run. Take a cold shower. You got to get out of there, man. But David didn't see what we see now. We're on the other side of it. He didn't see that this one night would cause 4 of his children to die. He didn't see that this one night would split his kingdom in half. And he didn't see that this one night would make him a murderer. See, that's why the Bible teaches us in times of temptation, there's only one thing to do. Run. Remember this. When you're tempted to do wrong, if you fight, you lose. If you run, you win. I'll say that again. If you fight, you lose. But if you run, you win. The Bible says this in 1 Corinthians 6:18. Flee from sexual immorality. You have to flee. You have to run. If you fight, you lose. If you run, you win. Whatever it means, and it may mean different things, you have to run. Now what this does is it reminds me of one of my favorite Geico commercials. And I'm going to show it to you, and then I'll tell you why. Look at this.
Let's find the attic.
No, in the basement. Why can't we just get in the running car?
Are you crazy? Let's rip out your chainsaws.
Smart. But you.
If you're in a horror movie, you make poor decisions. That's what you do.
I'm being quiet.
You see, when you're in the spin zone, it's like a horror movie. You make bad choices. I remember the first time I saw that, and I'm like, yeah, why don't you get in the running car? But that's what we do. We make bad choices, and it just continues to spiral downward. You have to flee temptation. Don't fight it. Now, we left David with Bathsheba's words, I'm pregnant. 3 words that made David's heart sink and his knees buckle and sent him spiraling down this zone. So we're going to continue reading in verse 6. So David sent this word to Joab. Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent him to David. And when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. A little bit of chit-chat going on. And then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So that's another phrase for take a bath, take a nice hot bath, relax. You've been in battle. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. I don't know what that gift was. But look at what the next verse says. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. David starts a plan that he hopes will get him out of this. His plan was bring Uriah home from battle, send him home for a hot bath, and hopefully, he's been away at war, he'll love on his wife, and then Bathsheba can say the baby is his. Problem solved. but it didn't work. Look at verse 10. David was told, Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. Now already you see that Uriah is a better man than David at this point. He's loyal to his king, he's loyal to his commander, and he's loyal to the men he fights with. And David is like, well, that didn't work. Let's try plan B. Then David said to him in verse 12, stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next, and at David's invitation he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. So David's plan B is to get him drunk, and then surely he'll go home, sleep with his wife, and then sleep it off. But in the evening, it says, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. Excuse me. He did not go home. And David just keeps spiraling downward. He comes up with another plan. Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. So he sends Uriah with this note. Uriah is carrying his own death warrant. So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. And when the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Now let me stop here and just give you some more biblical counsel before we go on. When you attempted to sin and you do sin, you need to confess it. Don't conceal it. Confess it. Don't conceal it. When David heard the words, I'm pregnant, if David at that moment had confessed his sin, confessed to God, confessed to Bathsheba, confessed to her husband Uriah, the bleeding would have stopped. The problem would have been contained to adultery, pregnancy out of wedlock, but most likely the marriage could have been rebuilt. Lives could have been saved. Relationships could have been restored. But faced with a choice in this horror movie, rather than confessing his sin, falling on his face before God and admitting his adultery, he chooses another route. So from what has been only originally a desire for a discreet evening of adultery is turning into betrayal, murder, and cover-up. And David made the age-old mistake that we all seem to make, that thinking that deception can cover disobedience, but it doesn't work that way. Deception never covers disobedience. It only makes it worse. Did you notice that it wasn't just Uriah who died? Did you notice that it said some of King David's men? And then Uriah? A lot of innocent people paid the price for David's sin on that battlefield. And that's why sin is so terrible. It never hurts just one person. Years later, David's son, Solomon, would write these words in a proverb. I'm going to put it up on the screen for you. He said this, whoever conceals their sin does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. Do you know who Solomon's mother was? Bathsheba. And I can't help but think possibly that was going through his mind, thinking of his dad, David, when he wrote these words. Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. You know, when we commit sin, we're immediately faced with one of two choices. We can confess it or we can conceal it. You either push the confess button or you push the conceal button. One button digs you out of a hole, the other just buries you deeper and deeper. And as you know, David's cover-up was uncovered, because here we are reading about it 3,000 years later. Cover-up always costs more than confession. Confess sin, don't conceal it. Finally, there's one statement at the end of this chapter that tells us why the whole chapter was not only unnecessary, but it was also futile. We're going to skip down to verse 26. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Now, I want you to circle that last phrase. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. God had seen the whole thing. You know, we live in a world where we now know the capacity of computers to record and retrieve the most personal details of our lives. Have you ever talked about, I'm thinking about buying one of these, and all of a sudden you open your Facebook page, and there's an ad about what you were going to buy. You know, we have video cameras when we check into hotels. We leave DNA evidence all over the place that can trace us back to wherever we've been. We have satellites that can photograph the earth with such precision that they can show the hair on our heads. How much more does God see and know all that we do? See, we think, well, things would be all right if God didn't see them, but God sees it all. So let me give you one final biblical counsel. Seek forgiveness, don't avoid it. Seek forgiveness, don't avoid it. David should have asked for forgiveness, but he didn't. In this whole chapter, he never asked for forgiveness. Some of you will remember back in the 90s when President Clinton was president, that he had his sin zone with Monica Lewinsky. You remember that? Dan Rather interviewed him. And you may remember this interview because here's what Dan Rather asked him. He asked him, why did he get involved with Monica Lewinsky? And here's what his answer was. Just because I could. Just because I could. I'm President of the United States. I'm the most powerful man in the world. I can do what I want. But then he went on to say, I think that is the most morally indefensible reason anybody could have for doing anything. When you do something just because you could. David could have sought forgiveness. David could have found forgiveness. For God is always willing to forgive. But I want you to remember this, and I want you to write this in your notes somewhere. God is always willing to forgive and forget, but he will not forget until he forgives. God is always willing to forgive and forget, but he will not forget until he forgives. We have to seek his forgiveness. David went 12 months and refused to seek forgiveness. He had managed to knock off 6 of the 10 commandments. He had coveted another man's wife. He committed adultery. He killed her husband. He stole his wife. He lied about it. And he dishonored his family. Right after that night with Bathsheba, it could have been a new beginning for David. To confess his sin, not conceal it, seek forgiveness, not avoid it. Now, he still would have had to suffer the consequences of sin. But at least he would have been a forgiven man. All that's necessary to enter that spin zone is to be in the wrong place, at the wrong time, the wrong person, and then do the wrong thing. How does that apply to us? Sooner or later, you will find yourself in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong person. And you'll have a choice to make. To enter the sin zone, the no sin zone that becomes the spin zone, or to run. You know, this story is about sexual sin, but this principle applies to any kind of sin. Moral, ethically, any kind of sin. Whenever you're tempted to do wrong, you have to run. If you fight, you lose. But if you run, you win. But if you do fall, if you do give in to that temptation, confess your sin. Don't conceal it. Just confess it right there before God. Confess it to that person that you've done something to. Do it then. Don't conceal it. And then realize that God specializes in forgiveness because of what Christ did on the cross to forgive us of our sin. Now, unfortunately, this story doesn't end here because of that last verse I had you circle. That what David had done, the Lord was displeased with. So there was a reckoning coming. A year with no forgiveness sought. There was something coming. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. The message is called A King's Ransom. I want you to pray with me, though, every head bowed and every eye closed as we end our time here today. There's not a person in this room that does not face temptation. Not a person in this room that doesn't find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. It's what happens after that. You can be at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person and still be okay if you make the right choice. But if you fall, you have entered the spin zone. I wonder today if God has brought something to your mind that you've done and you've never sought forgiveness. You've never confessed it. Maybe today's the day when you get that right. You say, God, I sinned. I tried to fight it, but I lost. And I'm here to confess it to you. And I seek your forgiveness. And there may be consequences that I have to pay, but I want to be right with you. And I want to be right with the people around me. And that may be where you are today. And if it's not where you are today, it will be where you are someday. Will you make the right choice? You may be here today and you've never established a relationship with God through what Christ did on the cross. And maybe you've been facing temptation. You know it's something not right about it, but you have no power to overcome it. And when you do overcome it, you don't know what to do. You can find a relationship with God like no other today by stepping across the line of faith and receiving Christ as your Savior. We had 8 students do that at camp this last week. They stepped across the line and they said, God, forgive me of my past with what you did on the cross for my sins. And you discover not only a God who loves you, but a God who forgives you and will help you move on. You discover that there's a reason you're here, purpose and plan for your life, and then you discover that God has eternity waiting for you. I encourage you to step across that line of faith if you've never done that today. And a lot like the same thing when we give our lives to Christ. We have to confess and we have to seek forgiveness. And I hope you'll do that today. Father, thank you so much for the example of David, albeit a bad example, but how we can learn to avoid the same mistakes and the same downward spiral in our lives. And I pray for every person in this room when they face temptation. Father, would you remind them of what that man in the t-shirt said today. To flee, to run. But if we do fall, help us to confess it and help us to seek your forgiveness. I pray for anyone here who needs to cross that line of faith today to follow you. I pray that they will receive that love that you have for them, that forgiveness that's waiting for them. And we look forward to what you're going to do in our lives as we leave this place.